Can you believe we're almost at the finish line? So, in this presentation, we're going to cover our readings for this week and provide some examples of what it might look like in an organization. First, we will be quickly going over Long's role biography to get us started. Then we will take a quick stroll with Knippenberg and look at leadership in the perspective of person in situation. Then we will follow up with group relations and the connection between the individual and the group by examining ORA analysis. Next, we'll take a journey to look at Wells's group as a whole, and then the presentation will come to an end with Turcotte's organizational role analysis. Let's get started. The term role biography is used to describe a biography of a person in role throughout various roles taken on within their lives. Role biography gives the role holder a strong sense of how the past may unconsciously influence their current role behavior. This can give the role holder a better understanding of their uniqueness in role. It can also provide a fuller understanding of where valencies in the role originate. So the role exploration is sometimes surprising for the role holder. Patterns that were not noted now come into focus. When conducted one-on-one with a consultant, role biography can be an important part of the coaching process. According to Knippenberg, past studies of personality and leadership have focused mainly on the linkages between personality and leadership style, rather than personality and leadership effectiveness. Unfortunately, this also means that studies show a lower correlation between personality and leadership when many personality dimensions are studied together, and this is usually how these studies are conducted. Additionally, people do not always act according to their dispositions. So, Knippenberg claims that in order to understand personality and leader effectiveness, we must understand the person in situation. He states, and I quote, that the relationship between leader personality and leader behavior can thus be understood as a function of situation strength and situation trait relevance. Leader personality should have little influence on leader behavior in strong situations or in situations with low trait relevance. That's a lot, so let's dissect that a little bit. According to person in situation theory, leadership effectiveness is a function of the interaction between leader personality and situation. Makes sense, right? So to Knippenberg, personality is made up of a person's dispositions, as opposed to a person's abilities, such as extroversion versus charisma. The situation is defined by the combination of task, followers, and the group and organizational context in which the leadership process is enacted. The claim in that leader personality and leader effectiveness is contingent upon the characteristics of the situation. The trait activation model of leadership explains Knippenberg's proposed process for person and situation, using Tett and Burnett's theories related to trait activation. What this means is the leader's personality is buffered by the situation's strength, which is the extent to which the situation is clear on what is appropriate and inappropriate behavior within the context of the situation. So there are strong situations and weak situations. Strong situations, such as soldiers in a march, would not necessarily elicit dispositions. Conversely, weak situations with less cues of how to behave would provide the opportunity for those dispositions to surface. Personality is also buffered by situation trait relevance, which is the extent to which situational cues are connected to trait responses. For example, an extrovert cannot be an extrovert if he or she is really not in the social situation. Once the leader behavior is informed, the appropriateness of the behavior to the situation then informs the leader effectiveness. It becomes really important to note that trait activations may bring out the expression of a trait, but that the expression of the trait does not guarantee desired outcomes. There are limitations to the effects of a leader's interactions with their followers, of course, and Knippenberg really makes a call for further research on this, as well as the specific combinations of traits, situations, and the resulting effectiveness of a leader. Now we move on to ORA, which is also known as organizational role analysis. This is born out of Group Relations Conference and the idea that participants of these often return to their organizations and change behaviors within their work environments. These conferences are usually profound in such a way that the Grubb Institute was able to develop ORA as a born product out of these conferences. They stem from here and now events such as Tavistock, and they happen with the consultation group. ORA focuses on participants examining their own and current work experiences in order to take on the roles in their organizations more effectively. Now, what does this mean? It means that participants are able to take on their roles in an intentional way. Suitable in most cases for clients who are in positions with duties in a managerial or leadership setting, or, more explicitly, someone who works in a position that is on the boundary of the system and the context in which it sits. It becomes important to note that ORA is most likely not suitable for people who operate through networks. These individuals will most likely need a different approach. All right, so let's attack the nuts and bolts. What is it? What is ORA? How is it conducted? An ORA is typically 8 2-hour sessions that sit about 2 weeks apart, and they are never conducted in the home setting of the client. This is so that the consultant does not place their own perception of the situation into the consultation. What's the goal of an ORA? The goal is to ultimately decipher the client's description of their experiences and how they interpret the reactions of others to them. Okay, what does this mean? It means that the task ultimately will reveal that the system, it is both conscious and unconscious in the client's mind. The consultant also pays attention to their own feelings in order to devise something sort of comparable to transference and countertransference. Extroversion is built into the ORA so that the consultant is not caught up in the client's system with them. Often, roles are perceived as static, prescriptive, and usually they draw a hard line between the individual and the role that they take on. ORA views roles as the person in role. That is, that the person is usually more dynamic, shifting and changing with the context. In ORA, a role is viewed as constructed by the emotional experience, such as those of like task, roles, purposes, boundaries, rituals, accountability, competence, failure, or success within the enterprise. This phenomena is known as organization in the mind, and it calls for management. Conversely, institution of the mind calls for leadership, and this is made up of other emotional experiences surrounding an individual, such as ideals, hopes, values, dreams, symbols, birth, death, life. This is not confined to the institution in which it is housed, and instead, it also has resonance within the context of the system and is influenced by it. A role is usually taken up by a person who adds their own desire to the aim that they have identified as the aim of the system, and then they choose an action or behavior that will achieve that final aim. If we're to think about it in this context, the observation of behaviors enables the consultant, together with the client, to deduce what system they're operating from. What does this mean? It means that the important distinction here is the person and the individual. The person is made up of all of their collective experiences, relationships, etc., and if given a role in the system, is expected to have some of the basic requirements for it. ORA clients are ultimately searching for practical, not therapeutic outcomes so that the differences to the system can be made. All right, so this is confusing. What does the process look like? Well, the client and the consultant together look for realities of the here and now, often describe linked activities without realizing what they mean. This means that the client will go on a description of what's going on in the system, and sometimes will describe things that may be linked that they don't know that they're linked, and that's what the consultant is there for. Pretty soon they arrive at the realization that their view is a mental construct. They can begin to gain a sense of the system and their mental image of it, and that their role is located on the boundary of that system and its context. The principle is a regulating one where the client can use feelings to challenge themselves to take risks with themselves and others in the system. In a sense, they begin to make the system socially and psychologically, essentially embodying the person in role. The psychological role is an internalized one, and the sociological role is the behaviors that are observed by others, or as they are observed by others. These can both be positive and negative. Often, the client will discover that maybe some of their behaviors are viewed in a derogatory manner by others. The consultant and the client will ultimately work together to form a hypothesis about the unknown and unconscious processes at work. Once arrived at a full mental image of the system, its boundaries, and its objective, the client can now begin to test her thinking, and she can take on that role. Committed to the actions, the client now considers that the factors and influences that he might not have noticed before. In this context, if we think of the group as a whole, which is a concept by Leroy Wells Jr., which examines interpersonal processes and group relationships. Wells suggests that a group is an open, living system that exchanges information and energy with the environment in which it exists. The group members are considered co-actors. These co-actors behave on behalf of the group. In other words, the single members of the group become carriers and communicators of the group's lived experience. Group membership can create ambivalent feelings. On one hand, there is a fear of being swallowed up by the group. On the other hand, is the fear of being alienated from the group. This tension can cause an individual's unconscious regression to the primitive defenses used in infants in relation to their mother. The model, group as a mother, draws on the parallels between infant in relation to mother and individual in relation to group. Just as mother both meets the needs of the infant and frustrates the infant, the group satisfies and disappoints the individual. Turcotte discusses group relations and reviews open and small group behaviors in work groups and basic assumption groups. These groups must have 8 to 12 members with a maximum of 16, with the typical structure of a board, senior faculty, or a cohort. It also must have a task that the group has to have if the group is to survive. A functioning small group must seek to find its primary task, both by definition and practicality. Even with more than one primary task, the group must decide which one to focus on at a time. Boundaries must be drawn between conflicting primary tasks to resolve tensions and confusions. Structure and primary task are internally linked. Therefore, primary task fulfillment requires an appropriate structure. So, when breakdowns exist in the group, the consultant should examine primary task products, which could be found in the external environment. If they are not found in the external environment, then the group is a closed system. A closed system group, their primary task involves interactions with the environment. Interactions between the group and the environment lead to the formation of a boundary between group and environment, leading to transactions across the boundary and also requiring a leader to control the boundary at interface. Conversely, an open system group have internal processes that strengthen the boundary between internal and external worlds and support the exercise of leadership function of boundary control. These functions are intake, compersion, and output. The challenge and complication here is that it becomes to both looking internally and externally. This is really hard for the leader because he is both the participant and the observer. Also, leadership in this case must act as a projection receptacle and to bear being used by the group. Turcotte ultimately adds to Bayon's basic assumption group, and he adds this basic assumption oneness group, where members seek to join in a union with an all-powerful force. This all-powerful force allows the individual to relinquish the self for indifferent participation so that they can feel the wholeness of the group. Since this task contains impossible elements, the group is often unstable. They tend to be self-contained closed systems which are not interested in predictions and consequences. If you're thinking about the individual and the group, when an individual enters a group, they end up facing the challenge of wanting to establish uniqueness while maintaining their relatedness to others. How this works. 2 mechanisms are at play, splitting and projection, and it has important consequences, causing 3 elements to increase, right? So the increased absence of responsibility, which responsibility is linked to disowned parts of the self, which are then projected elsewhere. Then you increase the power of dependency on the leader. Well, You increase the power of the leader and then dependency on the leader. By projection, the leader becomes the sole repository of the power, the skills, and reality testing. And then you also increase the cold, unfriendly nature of the world outside of the group, which leads to various fears that increase the strength of the seeking forces within the basic assumption group. Becomes a cycle. Turkett states that basic assumption groups are defenses against death, but like all psychological defenses, basic assumption groups have a content, which in fact is death. What ultimately lives on are the myths that the group creates to support the future generations. I think a perfect example that we can draw from for this week's readings is drawing our attention right back to the week in residence when Tasha was sitting at the front of the room giving her experience within her work. And then the group helped her arrive at certain conclusions while during explorations between maybe some of the interactions that she herself has as in the role she takes and the interactions that those cause with the systems and the outcomes that are coming out as a result. For the second example, we really want to provide an example of group as a whole. I want to draw your attention to the flagellant movement. This is in the 14th century, and the Black Plague. In the flagellant movement, it kind of became this ritualized, like, prototype for social alienation, right? Where the primary cause for the plague was absolutely clear. It was retribution for wickedness of the present generation. But people weren't exactly sure what they had done, but they knew that they were guilty. So there was a sense of collective guilt, and it just kind of, everybody was at fault. If you think about group flagellation, it can provide a really huge example of a socially induced and condoned self-mutilation, obviously. But also it really kind of gives an idea of this group as a whole kind of concept where the acts were actually in self-sacrifice and in service of the group, and they were attempts to control the uncontrollable. It's just something to think about. I know it's a bit of an extreme example, but I believe a clear one. This concludes our presentation. Thank you so much for stopping by and listening to us. This is Tasha. We are with Carlene, Erika, and Kiera. Have a great week, guys.